So, while things are looking pretty good in chapter 1, the foreshadowing, the undercurrent of the situation is growing and leading in a bad direction because they are not completing the work. And as Bob pointed out, the purpose was to completely drive them out and to be different, separate, more like God intended the role of mankind to be than what had taken place prior. Like I said, we're in a pretty good place, but the handwriting's on the wall. Would someone like to read chapter 2, 1 through 5 for us?
And Joshua, the son of Nun, sent chapter 2, 1 through 5?
Yes, 1 through 5, please.
Judges.
Judges, yeah.
Oh, Judges, I'm in Joshua.
That was a couple of months ago.
1 through 5, okay. And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilead to Boshin and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt, and have brought you unto the land which I share, or I swear unto your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of the land, ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their God shall be snares unto you. And it came to pass, when the angel of the Lord spake these words unto all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of that place Boshin, and they sacrificed there unto the Lord.
Okay, so the two places here in this reading are Gilgal and Bochum. And Gilgal we're familiar with, right? We read it over and over again throughout the book of Joshua. Now, I just set you up for failure when I said that, because I was getting ready to ask, why are we familiar with Gilgal? You remember? We read Joshua. Very observant, Shirley. Very observant. It was the home camp, right? That was the camp that they went out from. And that's why we read it so much. They would constantly go out from Gilgal to such and such a place or in such and such a direction. Now, does anyone know where Bochum is? And there's some head shaking now, and it's not just you and I that don't know where Bochum is. We do not know. There is not a known archaeology site for this place of Bochum. And I think there's some significance in that. Many of the Septuagint writers related it to Bethel. Does anyone know what Bethel means? What does El mean? Start there. El is God, right? So Bethel, Beth is house. So it's the house of God. When you read that throughout the Old Testament, and it's one of those places, Bethel is, that come up over and over again. And so there's significance in that it means the house of God. Now, whether it's in that location or not is uncertain. What is significant is what Bochum means. It means the weepers. And notice the angel of the Lord is coming from Gilgal, the place of victory, the place where God had been in the tabernacle throughout all the conquest, and he's going to the place of reaping. It's symbolic of what is taking place in the Israelites' lives at this time. In fact, they call it the place, or the weepers, because when they get the message from the Lord, they weep. They weep. So the angel of the Lord comes and he says, I've driven all the people out. I gave you this land. I told you I would never forsake you. And yet you've utterly left me. And he said, so I am not going to continue to drive these people out. Instead, they are going to be a thorn in your side. There's a lot of parallels here, aren't there? Number 1, chapter 1. When we have false sin in our life that we refuse to deal with. We're not talking about making mistakes, or I'm not talking about making mistakes. I'm talking about doing like the Israelites are, where we say, I can live with this. It's all right. We can go to the mall together, Pam. Have a good time. That's what or worse yet, what the Israelites really did, they weren't going to the mall with their faults. They were trying to enslave their faults. But we never enslave sin, do we? It enslaves us. And that's what's taking place here. God says that I am going to use these people to be thorns in your side. Now, the obvious answer is God would do that to punish the people, right? Is there another reason for that? This is a little more abstract. What I'm thinking of isn't directly said. Can you think of any other reasons why God might use them as thorns in the side?
Teach them a lesson.
Teach them a lesson? Yeah, I think that's very possible. Likely, actually, part of it, certainly.
Further in, you see him use that to show his power.
To show his power? That's
Later on, you see that.
yeah, that's definitely part of it, isn't it? Both these things are not what I was thinking of, but absolutely true and part of it. God's going to demonstrate his power through these people. I think also part of the message is that they're going to have thorns in the side because they are becoming just like the Canaanites. The reason God is driving the Canaanites out of the land is because they're wicked. They've corrupted the land. They're sacrificing their children. They're doing despicable things that are harmful and destructive to mankind and God's purpose and will. And the Israelites are doing the same thing. David, you probably haven't got as many of these as I have, but every once in a while you might get a speeding ticket, right? That's not anything you're ever happy about, is it? I've never been happy about
Not
one.
anymore, they got expensive.
Yeah. Not as expensive as the gas as it takes to speed. But what's the positive side about a speeding ticket? Maybe I need to slow down, right? Yeah. Maybe you think twice before you do anything, like it says. I think there is something to that with this, with God's people. He's checking them because the direction they're going is not a positive direction. There's some obvious applications to our own lives with that not all discipline is, in fact, discipline by its nature is constructive, is useful. Questions or comments? One last point, they sacrifice to the Lord there. We see them mournful, we see them turn to God, but what do they not do? They don't deal with the problem, right? they don't deal with it. It's interesting, as people, how oftentimes we do this. You know, too many bugs come through that front door. Too many bugs come through the door. You know, bugs are constantly coming through the door. Close the door, right? Yeah, a lot of times as people, we'd rather complain and keep the problem than fix it. And that is where I think the Israelites fall short here. They're mournful. They sacrifice to the Lord 2 good things, but they don't fix the problem. They don't, in this case, pick up their armor and go back to war and finish the job. They leave it. All right, with that then, would someone read 6 through 10 for us?
Joshua had let the people go. The children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, and he did for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnah-Heres, in the mount of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill of Gosh. And also all the generations were gathered unto the fathers, and those arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel.
Thank you. So I meant to mention this before we get started, but chapter 2 is the overview of the rest of the book, right? We see this spiraling downward trend in the people where we get further and further and further away from God. And so the passage that Mike just read, 6 through 10, is telling about Joshua's death. Well, we've already read about that at the end of Joshua. Why are we retelling it? Because it's a pivotal point in this downward spiral. And so we're telling it now in the context and through the eyes of where the rest of this book is going to go. And so he dies at 110 years old, and the people bury him, and all the people that bury him remain faithful. Pretty good deal, right? Not bad. What happens when they are gone?
Oh, they forgot. They didn't even think of the Lord, the new generation.
New generation didn't even think of it.
They didn't even know what the Lord did for Israel.
Yep. Didn't know what the Lord did for them. Let's take a moment. I think it is important to define that. Did not know. Do you think these people had no knowledge of what took place? It seemed very improbable that they had no knowledge, right? After 400 years of being in Egypt, Moses seems to have some level of understanding that God was going to deliver them, right? And we're just a handful of years, 40 years or so after the death of Joshua. What does that word know mean?
Have a relationship with him.
Have a relationship with. And that's used in couples a lot, right? In fact, you'll hear said to know someone in a biblical sense. They're talking about that Old Testament way of knowledge. To have a relationship with, or I think in broader terminology, to have an experience with, right? To know it firsthand. That for me is a pivotal part of what this little passage is about and the downside of the book of Judges. A couple of weeks ago when we started into Judges, conversation came up about where generations are now and where our society is going further away from God. In many ways, it is. Let me ask this question, and don't answer it because I don't want to drive more division away. I just want you to think about it. Whose fault is that? Is it the generation in verse 10 who did not know the Lord? And really they want nothing to do with him? Or is it the prior generation's fault? Right? That's okay, Bob. No, I did, but you'll see why in a moment. It's all right. And here's why, because I think this is applicable for us today. That's why I didn't want. And ultimately, we all fail at this at times, and I think generally speaking, people don't even attempt to do it. What we need in the church today is each generation working together for the good of Christ's cause. You may say for the church. That has problems in it too. If we are working for the good of Jesus, the church will be strong. But each of us who've had experiences define the church through our own experiences. The point being, it takes every generation working together to get done what we need to get done. And the reason I ask that question, whose fault is it? It is, inevitably, most likely the older, now you blew this theory away, Bob, but most likely the older you are, the more likely you are to say the younger generation. So maybe you helped me build that bridge I was looking for anyhow. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to say, well, it was the older generation. In actuality, we have to accept, I think, that putting a percentage is probably useless, but both generations have a fault, right? The younger generation's fault here is obvious. They turned their back on God, right? What was the fault of the older generation in this situation? It was more subtle, wasn't it, David? They turned in the prior chapter, didn't they? Before they were dead.
They did it, remember?
Yeah.
For sure. Just like we forget.
And because they'd done that, they were not pure anymore.
Yeah. They were not pure. So how would that younger generation known God? It had to be through the older generation, right? The older generation saw God because he rescued them out of Egypt. Now, that generation would have been really young. Joshua, 110 years old, would have been the oldest of those. But a lot of these people would have been alive when God rescued them out, split the Red Sea, did all those miracles, and then drove the people out. How was the younger generation supposed to see God? It was because they were to be different. Their nation was to be different than the rest of the world. But it wasn't. It wasn't different. We weren't pure anymore. Right? we weren't leading away. The application, I think, for us in the book of Judges is about leadership. And man, when it comes to the church, that's what we're lacking. Leadership. That's what we're needing, leadership. And for the church to be that experience where people can know God. And if we're not, the next generation can't know God. Here's my point. We can't sit in this building and throw rocks at all the generations and people who aren't here without accepting responsibility for that. And when we accept responsibility for it, we say, hey, what can I do to be different? Close the door, right? And start doing what we are supposed to do. To know God. These people were still, at this point, still sacrificing, as we just demonstrated. They were still going through all the rituals of worship. That's about to change. But yet, they weren't what God had intended them to be. Let me clarify one point and then open it up. When I say our fault, I mean me too. And what I mean is not any individual fault, but that the church must be focused not on 4 hours a week, but on living Christian lives and showing people what it's like to contact God. And that's attractive. And people tend to be drawn to it. Now, that other generation, I focused on the older generation there. The younger generation has to have a part in that as well, right? But it takes both. Questions or comments? All right. Here's the result, 11 through 15. Would someone like to read that for us? And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asheroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers and plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So, 11 is a sobering verse, isn't it? We're slowly eking away, slowly getting more and more stained, corrupted. And now it's to a point where we can't even see God anymore. We can't recognize him. So we completely abandon him. But something's always the God of our lives, isn't it? Something always takes priority. Isn't that really a very fundamental definition of God? What takes priority? What is first? What is preeminent in our life? And so something's always going to be on top. when it's not God. In this case, it was Baal or Asheroth. It was the false gods of the land. There's still false gods today. I say that because I think sometimes we can think these people are so silly worshiping these other gods, but temptation's still there for us today. They just look different, right, than a wooden or a golden idol. They served them. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. And so all these people, the Canaanites, and we're going to see people of Moab, we're going to see people from Mesopotamia, which is north, which is Mesopotamia is north. Moab is going to be a little bit east. The Canaanites are mostly from the southwest of them. All these people are eventually going to take turns plundering the Israelites and giving them hard times. Is it the strength of the Canaanites that became problematic for the Israelites? Did the Canaanites just get too powerful, and that's why they began to lose, why the Israelites began to lose? No. This is why I find that I focus on, instead of being focused on how corrupt society is and how wrong politics are going and how wrong this direction in life is and that direction. As people of God, we're not supposed to be victims. It's our job to influence people. And so if we're chronically losing battles, it's not because the enemy is too strong. We've got to examine what we're doing. And this principle is played out over and over and over every time that God's people are oppressed or defeated in the Old Testament. That's the bottom line. They weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. So they completely lose and are plundered, and this is a period of better part of 300 years that's described in one paragraph here. They were in sore distress. So God would send them a deliverer, and right back to the same old, same old. Another point of clarification just occurred to me from what I just said. Are God's people defeated today?
Sometimes we act like it.
Sometimes we act like, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. David shaking his head, no, though. No, we're not. We're not. We are a bit on our heels. And we're not in this position. And we don't want to be either, right? And that's the encouraging part of me. And that's what Judges ultimately is a book of hope. Because if they just do what they need to do, things get good. And so that hope is constantly there. Questions or comments in that passage? David.
About Josiah, 8 years old.
Yeah.
Wanted to turn back.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what's amazing about Josiah, he says, he starts with, just clean up the temple. And you talk about how far people came. They found the Torah in the temple, and they're like, what's this? We talked about in verse 19 or verse 10 They didn't know God. I mean, that's really not knowing God, right? They'd lost all their Bibles. Yeah, 8 years old. David, that's interesting too, because Josiah's revival was very temporary. And all these good and these judges, they come about. Of course, these judges aren't exactly righteous people. Some of them, a lot of them have very serious issues, but they were temporary revivals. And what's alluded to very early in this book is that it can't be a temporary. That's where you have the one generation that were faithful till they died, and the next generation didn't even know God. True revival is got to be more than that. Yep. It doesn't take much. Is that part of your point too, with emphasizing an 8-year-old? Yeah.
And they forgot again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. Thank you for sharing it. Would someone like to read 16 through 21, please?
The Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowing themselves unto them, and turning quickly out of the way which their fathers walked, in obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. And when the Lord raised them up judges, when the Lord was with the judges, and delivered them out of the hands of their enemies, all the days of the judges, for it repented the Lord because of their groaning by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass, when the judges was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them, and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doing, nor from their stubborn ways. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenants, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice.
Two more, if you will, through the
Okay.
end of the chapter, please.
I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died, that though them I may prove Israel whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk therein, as their fathers did keep it or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivering to them the hand of Joshua.
All right, thank you, Bob. So, verse 15 ends with the people being in sore distress because they turned their back on God, and so he actually hinders them in battle, and they're oppressed by their enemies. Verse 16 then says, but God doesn't leave them there. He would raise up judges to deliver them. And we talked about this last week, but judges are not like we think of judges sitting on a bench. These are leaders. They are deliverers, right, as the essential concept of what the judges are. They very often did judge the people as well, as far as would decide right and wrong in cases, like we would think of a judge. But they were much, much more than that. And so he'd raise up a judge, the judge would deliver them, things would go well, and immediately they would go back. We were kind of talking about this idea when David brought up Josiah, right? And it occurred to me as Bob was reading this, it's kind of like the idea of a diet. And I'd ask why diets don't work, but we'd get too many answers, right? I don't need a diet. You know what I need? Amanda's eyebrows raised. She's like, I beg to differ. I don't need a diet. What I need some lifestyle changes. Right? That's why diets don't work at their core. You might be able to come up with some other reasons, I don't know. But at their core, a diet typically is something we do for a while to obtain a goal, and then we just go back to what we wanted to do anyhow. And that very much is like what the people are doing. Oh, we're in terrible shape. We better go on a diet. And so they get a personal trainer, and they go on their diet, and they get all healthy, right? And everything's good. But then they go back to doing exactly what got them in trouble before. And I think in our lives, that's a substantial difference. Sometimes we get caught up in diets as far as I need to fix this behavior, or I need to look better in this way, as far as like, don't let people see my problems. That's what I mean by that, right? Now, I'll avoid that. Versus the New Testament talks so much about the Spirit of God, and we sometimes think of that solely in the supernatural, which we see aspects of that through the New Testament. But a big part of the Spirit of God is God's Spirit encompassing me. Meaning that I'm like God. I act like God. I don't just not do something mean to Amanda. I love her. Right? Sometimes we get caught up in the behaviors. Oh, I can't trip her. It's against the rules. And we get very focused. Oh, you can't trip her. You can't trip her. And we forget really what we're supposed to do. And that, I think, maybe symbolizes or is representative of what goes on here. They'd have a judge, things would go well, and the moment the judge is dead, they go back to the same old. And that latter part of the reading, 21 and 22, where God said, so I didn't drive the people out. Why didn't he drive them out? To test them. What's God getting at? They are meant to be a nation different. And they can't do that without accepting his way. And they're not doing that. They want their cake and eat it too, right? Although when it comes to sin and unrighteousness, it's more like wanting our cyanide, eat it too. And yet we go back to it. All right, we have just enough time. I thought about stopping here before we get into 3, but I think we'll cover 1 through 6, and then we'll pick up with Othniel next week. Verse 1 of chapter 3, now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars of Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had known it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on the Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon, as far as Lemanoth. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Essentially, at the end of verse 6, they become just like all the other people. They're no different. And we've been emphasizing through Joshua And so far in Judges, it was not about God being on their side. It's about whether they are on God's side or not. I'll leave you with this very positive thought because chapter 2 is a lot of negativity, and that's the book of Judges. The message going forward is all these deliverers who are insufficient to deliver the people, scarcely physically, let alone spiritually. And they're more and more insufficient. And the ultimate hope is that it's all pointing towards the deliverer who is able to deliver us. And ultimately today, it's in his leadership, in his deliverance, that we count on and have faith. Just in case there's any that haven't figured out who that was. It was Jesus. He was the deliverer. Thank you.